Thank you so much, sir. Great to have you here with Voice of America Persian Service. Let me ask you this, because you have a very colorful background and experience, specifically dealing with malign actors in the world. I'm sure you are very familiar with the acts and behaviors of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Could you let us know when was the first time that you dealt with the Iranian behavior, and when was the last time?
Well, first of all, it's great to be with you, and it's great to be on Voice of America Persian Service. Well, my first dealings with the Iranians date back to my time on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee as the National Security Advisor to the chairman of the committee back then. Iran at that time, and here I'm talking about the mid-90s, Iran was the foremost state sponsor of terrorism, responsible for the murders of countless Americans and others. Just think about the EMEA bombing, for instance, in Argentina. And they continue to be so today. And so, I continue to, in every capacity possible, to try to work against the regime in Tehran and on behalf of the Iranian people. And I'd like to think that at Hudson, we carry a strong message of support for the Iranian people and a strong condemnation of the malign behaviors of the regime.
It's great that you mentioned that, because we're getting close to anniversary of Mahsa Amini killing inside Iran. So many people are just debating now that if Islamic Republic always survives some kind of uprising, but this might be the one that they cannot survive anymore, because they are doing more China model of suppression and not letting anything move them. Do you think that's a capability that you could acquire?
Well, the repression is severe, and in particular, the repression that they are directing at women and young girls, but really at anybody who raises their voice in criticism of the regime. And I think that, given the Ayatollah's days clearly are numbered, the regime is clamping down, and we should be absolutely unequivocal in our support for the Iranian people, and my hope is that someday soon we'll have an administration that's prepared to support them.
We talked about proxy of Islamic Republic and their destruction. You dealt with them on financial front as well. Could you open it to us? What are the characteristics? What are they doing? How they need to be stopped? And why is it that they are somehow successful still in some ways?
Well, let's work backwards from where we stand today to where things stood in 2020 when I left office along with all my colleagues in the Trump administration. Now today, the Iranian regime is selling 1.75 million barrels of oil a day to China. In contrast, in 2020 and 2019, we had cut that to maybe 200,000, 300,000 barrels a day. So the amount of money that the regime in Tehran is raking in from these oil exports is significant. I'm talking about $50 billion a year that they are making off of these oil sales. The number of tankers, we had the number of these shadow tankers that they were using down to a handful, and we were relentlessly pursuing them around the world, both with sanctions, with interdiction efforts, with Department of Justice seizures and forfeitures of their cargo, you name it. Now, because the Biden administration has walked away from the sanctions that we imposed, the maximum economic pressure campaign that we implemented, they have more than 380 of these ghost tankers. Malaysia, for instance, is not even kidding. They're not even pretending anymore with regard to the transshipment and the masking of the origins of the Iranian oil. And of course, that is the Iranian budget, right? 70 or more % of the Iranian government's budget comes from those oil sales. So when you're talking about $50 billion a year, that is a massive cash influx to a regime that then turns around and funnels the money to their terror proxies and into their nuclear weapons program and into their ballistic and cruise missile programs that they're supplying, for instance, to Russia. And we are seeing the violence spike yet again. As we found after the Obama administration, the violence spiked, and it's happening again. History is repeating itself in a really dangerous and very regrettable way.
To your point, this has been raised since the start of Biden administration. Every time I check with OFAC, they say all the sanctions are there, nothing has been removed. Also, the White House latest numbers, they said we were tough on Islamic Republic of Iran, and we set 571 new sanctions on them.
Well, look, the numbers speak for themselves. When Iran's GDP grew at a faster pace last year than ours did, right? Almost 4% growth, where we're at what, 2% here in the United States? The expansion in their exports and running a current account surplus through those exports has clearly indicates that the Biden administration is not actually implementing and actually enforcing the sanctions that are on the books. It's true that they haven't walked away from the sanctions we imposed because they got themselves into a trap by agreeing that they wouldn't remove anybody who had supported terrorism. Well, that's pretty much everybody that we sanctioned in the Trump administration, either terrorism or human rights abuses or corruption or all the above. But they just have refused to go after those tankers, refused to go after the oil exports. And if you don't do that, you cannot stop the flow of money into Hamas, into Hezbollah, to the Houthis, to the Iraqi militias, all of whom are receiving both cash and weapons from the regime in Tehran. And you see what happens. October 7 happens, slaughter of the Israelis, and you see now the Houthis relentlessly attacking. In fact, they just have caused a massive ecological disaster by striking a crude tanker with 10 times the amount of crude that the Exxon Valdez spill was involved in. So this is again, the violence is surging because the mullahs have the cash.
Mr. Billingslea, twice in the last two presidential debates in Iran, your name came up, and they were debating because the previous government in Iran by Hassan Rouhani when he was president, they were pushing for joining FATF to be able to have some kind of a interaction, monetary interaction without any flag. But most of Islamic Republic were against it. Can Iran, with this behavior, with this experience, even capable to join FATF?
So as you mentioned, I was president of the Financial Action Task Force when Iran was yet again put on the FATF blacklist, of which there are very, very few countries. North Korea is really the only other major one. And the reason that Iran is still on the FATF blacklist is for a combination of two things. First, fundamental systemic problems in their policing of their banking system and in their ability to prevent money laundering. Of course, why? Because the regime launders money for itself. I mentioned all of the oil revenue that's coming into the country, but at the same time, you have inflation at 50%. You have the rial trading at 600,000 to the dollar. People's life savings have evaporated, and it's clearly not because of sanctions, but because the money isn't going to the people. It's padding the pockets of the Ayatollah and the other elites, and it's going to the Quds Force for the terror proxies, and it's going into the weapons programs. So corruption is a major, major problem in Iran, and that is one of the key reasons that they're on the blacklist. But the other more fundamental reason that FATF put them yet again on the blacklist after the Obama administration took them off arbitrarily as part of the nuclear deal is that Iran has refused to forswear the financing of terrorism. One of the preconditions to be either a FATF member or a member of a FATF-style regional body is forswearing terrorist financing, and Iran has refused to do so.
In that same debate that your neighbor came up, there was this guy who was talking. He said, we have a team that runs around in a region and starts new banks from time to time and puts some money, then we can do interaction. Then as soon as they found it's a terrorist or sanctioned by the United States, it goes down, but then we go to another. How is it? Is there any truth to that? And if so, how can they easily move around a financial market with labels that they have, like terrorism funding or terrorism actions?
So it's not as easy as that sounds. It actually takes quite a bit to establish a bank or a financial institution. But one of the key things with regard to sanctions, especially if the goal is to put massive pressure on an economy like Iran's, which is an exporting economy, you have to be relentless in enforcement because they do look for ways to get around those sanctions. I'll give you an example. As we began to really see the sanctions take hold in 2019, Hassan Nasrallah became incredibly desperate. In fact, he started going on television, on Lebanese television, begging for donations. He had to cut back services to Hezbollah members and to prioritize the stipends to those who had their sons go off and get themselves killed in Syria. And so things like hospital services to rank and file members were being reduced. So Nasrallah cooked up some of the most bizarre evasion schemes together with Qasem Soleimani before he was eliminated. And then it included some of these strange black market oil tankers that involved Hezbollah, the Iranian Quds Force, shipments to Syria, and then onward banking into Russia. But we disrupted those efforts each and every time. We found them using Al-Balad Bank in Iraq as basically a Quds Force bank, and we sanctioned that bank and took it out of existence. It can be done. It was done effectively in the Trump administration, but it's not being done currently.
One thing we hear from the Islamic Republic of Iran over the year, they say they are very good at evading sanctions. But is evading sanctions a skill that you can be best at, or you need a reliable partner to do so? So, for example, someone in Iraq or UAE or I don't know which country has to be willing to work with you to be able to do that. Otherwise, there's no way they can do that. Is that a correct assumption?
It is a correct assumption, whether we're talking about willing Chinese teapot refineries who are buying this Iranian oil, claiming to be Malaysian oil, but they know it's Iranian. They don't care. And there's no consequences imposed on them for doing so currently. There were under the previous administration. But what's worse is that under the Biden administration, this U.S. government has actually given a green light for some of these countries to work with Iran. I'll give you some examples. They gave permission as part of a hostage ransom for South Korea to pay the Iranians $7 billion through Qatar that had been frozen in escrow during our years. What's worse is they recently gave the Iraqis a green light to pay the Iranians in hard currency, here I'm talking about dollars and euros, for natural gas imports into Iraq and for electricity into Iraq. And on top of that, then you see the Iranians turn around just a few days ago and negotiate a gas swap deal with Turkmenistan in order to supply more natural gas to the Iraqis. So it's not just that there are complicit actors that are enabling some of these bad behaviors, but you actually have a U.S. government that has not only turned a blind eye, but given a green light in some cases. That's why we've said under the Biden administration that the Iranian regime has made more than I actually put it closer to $130 billion in additional revenues that they did not have.
I wanted to ask you about, is there any possible consequences for administration not enforcing the sanctions, because they cannot remove the sanctions? Some of them are set by the U.S. Congress, and they're the only one who can remove it. But not enforcing it is, can they even? How is that even possible? You say, no, we're not going to enforce sanctions anymore, but it was set by the government and it's still effective. It should be effective.
Most of the sanctions, including those adopted through legislation, do give latitude to the executive branch in terms of waiving certain measures or how they interpret the evidentiary standards and so on. And I'm a big proponent of that. I think that you have to give the executive branch latitude. But when the executive branch is derelict in its duty to follow the law, and to really just do the right thing by going after the finances of the world's foremost terror-sponsoring regime, it's up to Congress to hold them accountable, and if necessary, to impose mandatory sanctions. Unfortunately, the Senate in particular, which is run by the Democrat Party, has refused to impose those mandatory sanctions. We did see the adoption of some measures, some important measures that were done in conjunction with the spending bill for aid to Ukraine, aid to Israel, and aid to Taiwan. There was a package of sanctions measures that were pushed through in connection with that, but that's more of an exception than the rule.
Speaking of Congress, I remember there was a time that there were such a huge bipartisan issues in Washington, D.C., like support for Israel or terrorism activity of Islamic Republic. Do you think we still have that, or what we're seeing right now on this main issue that was supposed to be bipartisan for many years?
It should be bipartisan, and it was once. It is not today. I mentioned that I was working on the Foreign Relations Committee. We had multiple occasions back in the 90s when the Clinton administration did not want to impose sanctions, for instance, on India or Pakistan for their nuclear weapons programs. And my senator at the time, who was chairman of the committee, worked very closely with John Glenn, the famous astronaut and senator from Ohio, to impose mandatory sanctions that the Clinton administration could not get around. So there are instances, there have been many, many instances in our history of good, strong bipartisan support for using financial measures to curtail the malign behaviors of our enemies. Unfortunately, I don't see a willingness on the part of the Democratic Party to challenge their own executive branch in that way these days.
Yeah, you have a very, very rich experience, so I wanted to talk to you about this. Since 2016, with the Obama administration and JCPOA with Islamic Republic, every couple of years there was a seesaw of policy change over from the United States toward Islamic Republic of Iran. I understand that's democracy, then the will of the people, the elected government comes in and does whatever he wants. But issues like foreign policy, I mean, this should be first and foremost for the consider the interest of the United States, and also it should have some perspective to the future. What's the danger of having, from what U.S. had before with Iran, then to JCPOA, then to maximum pressure, then to what we are facing now that you eloquently put together? And probably if we have a Republican administration, goes away back the way it was before. What are the dangers of not having much of a focus on the perspective of U.S. National security?
Well, the danger is a failure to acknowledge that Iran is not a responsible actor, and that they cannot be trusted, and they cannot be allowed to generate this kind of revenue, that organizations like the Houthis are in fact foreign terrorist organizations, despite the Biden administration undesignating them as such, and that organizations like Hezbollah and Hamas and the other terror apparatus of the Iranians have American blood on their hands. Now, the reason that you had the policy seesaw over Iran's nuclear program, and I want to talk a little bit about that, but the reason that you had that seesaw is because the Obama-Biden administration realized it was such a bad deal that they were not going to be able to sell it as a treaty to the United States Senate. And unfortunately, the United States Senate didn't insist. They allowed the Obama-Biden administration to proceed with this non-legally binding arrangement, and you see the results. So the next administration was certainly free to change policy. Treaties are binding, and treaties have, they outlast administration to administration. But in this case, it was such a bad deal, as President Trump said, that it clearly needed to be reversed, and that Iran needed to be held to account. But when you talk about the situation we face today, it's gotten materially worse, not just with respect to the terrorism issues that I've mentioned, but with regard to Iran's nuclear program itself. So when we left office, Iran had no known stocks of highly enriched uranium, 0. Now they have more than 800 kilograms of highly enriched uranium, of which a significant percentage is at what they call the 60% enrichment level, which in essence means that they're 95 to 99% of the way to being able to make a bomb. And so what a number of experts and what the Biden administration itself have acknowledged is that Iran is now on that nuclear threshold. You know, they had 500 centrifuges spinning when we left office. Now they have more than 9,000 centrifuges spinning to make this highly enriched uranium. And that's why people are warning that literally they are within a few weeks, if they chose, if the Ayatollah chose, they are within a few weeks of being able to begin fabricating nuclear devices. It should be very concerning that our Director of National Intelligence has, since 2019, every year reassured Congress that Iran was not taking steps to produce a testable nuclear device. Except just a few months ago, the DNI was unable to make that assurance to Congress going forward. They actually deleted that phrase entirely. That tells us something. That tells us that Iran is now moving towards possessing a nuclear weapon. And the next administration is going to have to take steps to reverse that.
We talked about the next administration. If it's Republican or it's a Trump administration, we might, see back to the maximum pressure or even higher. But, excuse me. But if it's a Democrat, if it's a Harris administration, do you think any change of policy to vis-a-vis Islamic Republic of Iran from the United States, or they will follow the same policy that Biden administration had?
I'm very concerned that it might be even worse policy than the Biden-Harris administration.
In what way worse?
Even more accommodating, even more concessions. But don't take my word for it. Just listen and look at what the Iranian regime is doing. They're actively trying to kill President Trump and other members of his administration, former officials. We just had the FBI arrest a Pakistani who was hired by the Iranians to organize a hit. We now know that the Iranian regime has hacked President Trump's presidential campaign and tried to spill dirty laundry to the U.S. media. So they're actively trying to influence the U.S. media. In fact, the intelligence community has said they were behind funding some of the protests that have erupted across the country in relation to Hamas and Hamas's butchery of the Israeli citizens. So the Iranian regime itself is running scared that President Trump will return to, at a minimum, the policies that he adopted that brought them teetering certainly to insolvency, to the point where the money and the weapons for the terror apparatus dried up, and there was a great deal of domestic unhappiness and protest that were beginning to grow. We'll need to get back to that in the next administration. Can the Harris-Waltz team achieve that? I have my doubts.
Speaking of maximum pressure campaign, the administration argues that whatever limitation that Islamic Republic had in its nuclear program was because JCPOA was working and they cannot breach of any of it. So that's why it was already down to, as you said, very low levels and not out of control. They claim that maximum pressure made it just go through the way that it's out of control at now.
Well, they're just making up things. The numbers speak for themselves, right? So we exited the JCPOA in 2019 or 2018, late 2018, and began imposing those sanctions in 2019 and 2020. So the numbers I gave you about 0 HEU and about almost no centrifuges, these are just facts. They're inconvenient facts for an administration that has done everything possible to accommodate the Ayatollah and his thugs and have gotten nothing to show for it other than October 7, the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea, the attacks on U.S. service, the killing of U.S. service members by Iranian proxies in Iraq, and so on. So this is a failed policy. The only measure of a policy are the results, and the results are damaging to U.S. national security.
I don't know how it is now, because something happened in Iran in 2022 was killing of Mahsa Amini that changed everything. But the opponent of there was an idea against maximum pressure in that time, because President Trump suggested that I can make a deal with the Iranian regime. So that was the thing that made people worry. Secretary Pompeo put 12 point
right.
conditions for them to be able to do that if they want to. So that that the fear was that maybe this Islamic Republic can find a deal to make with President Trump and stay in power in any ways. Do you think if that was the case, there would is it even possible to reach a deal with the Islamic Republic of Iran?
So I think Secretary Pompeo laid out very clearly those principles by which Iran has to behave if they're going to be reintegrated into the international community. And at the core of those conditions is what I spoke about in connection with the Financial Action Task Force, which is the expectation that all freedom-loving countries, all democracies around the world have, that you don't engage in terrorism. So the regime in Tehran, first and foremost, has to forswear terrorism. This axis of resistance filth that they spew is code for funding terrorism. And so at the end of the day, if you were to implement those conditions that Secretary Pompeo laid out, if that were the position of a future administration, then I think that is a workable solution. Clearly, Iran has to back away from the nuclear threshold. That is unacceptable. That, at least for almost till this administration, clearly a red line, and should be a red line, and hopefully will be a red line in the future if they decide to actually begin building a bomb.
So you would think if they agree to those 12 conditions, that would be something to work. So, but in that case, they're not Islamic Republic anymore. So probably they are much more reliable partner in doing things.
I live for the day that Iran is not run by bloodthirsty theocrats. I would love to someday visit Tehran. Clearly not in the cards for me currently, but hope springs eternal.
Yeah, let me ask you about the foreign policy of Biden administration toward the Islamic Republic. President Biden, even from campaigning, said that he wants to bring U.S. back to JCPOA. And he put many efforts in the beginning just to do that, and they couldn't find it, which is, I understand that. I mean, that was an objective he wanted to follow. But something happened in between, and it was Russia attack against Ukraine and Islamic Republic of Iran aiding Russia. That would have been something that by any calculation would have made White House to recalculate its Iran policy. But for some reason it didn't. Why do you think that is?
This is an administration that is terrified of its own shadow. They are constantly worried about escalation, whether it's escalation that the Iranians engage in or escalation by the Russians. They live in genuine fear of that. This is also an administration that has decided that in order to slowly boil the frog, to use that phrase, by decarbonizing the United States, that we should buy oil and allow dictators to sell their oil, which is why the Biden administration has refused to actually sanction Russian oil exports, which is why Vladimir Putin's war machine continues to tick along, because they're making between $600 to $800 million a day in oil sales. I've already talked a little bit about the Iranian oil sales. It's not a blind spot that they just have for Iran. It's a worldview where they talk loudly and they don't carry a stick at all. So we really have to see a return to Theodore Roosevelt's maxim of speaking softly and carrying a very large stick, which is precisely what the Trump administration did.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the politics of it. I understand the campaign, promising things to the politicians, but there are some experienced diplomats at the White House. So Brett McGurk, I mean, he has a very long-standing experience, but how is it that you still, as you pointed out, give more concessions to Iran and not getting anything in return? I mean, that should bring some kind of at least conversation or recalculation.
Samuel Beckett penned a fascinating sort of surreal play called Waiting for Godot. Two guys under a tree. The whole play is these two men waiting for Godot to show up. And Godot never shows up. And that's precisely been this negotiating strategy that they've adopted with the Iranians, waiting for the Iranians to show up. And the Iranians just play them and play them and play them. And the reason that the Iranians are playing them so effectively is because they're already getting all the concessions that they could want. They got the 10 billion in Iraqi payments for natural gas. They got the 7 billion from the South Koreans. They're getting the 50 billion in oil sales to China and India every single year. So what motive does the Iranian regime have to actually show up and negotiate? It's bad negotiating skills. But at the end of the day, and I have Brett McGurk in the highest respect, but this responsibility resides with the president and with the vice president. This resides with Biden and Harris. This is their failed policy.
I want to ask you about the comparison of 4 years of maximum pressure campaign and 4 years of Biden foreign policy. And one of the main objectives of either two was stopping or pausing Iran nuclear program. And either way, it didn't happen. So do you think we need the third option, or these are the options that there are still works that hasn't been done or implemented correctly or thought about some new ways of doing it?
So the Iranian nuclear program is a massive drain on the economy. I mean, digging that deeply into these mountains to build facilities like Fordo, spending all that money on centrifuges, spending all that money on the nuclear fuel cycle, that costs a great deal. And so one of the ways to slow down and degrade their ability, just one way, is through the application of economic and financial measures. But there are other things that have to be done as well. And we were doing those things together with our close friends and allies during the administration. At the end of the day, the regime has to understand that there are direct consequences for their vicious behavior, and Qasem Soleimani is a textbook example.
I wanted to ask you about how China is cozying up with the Islamic Republic. During all these years, more than 40 years, Islamic Republic always tried to find a new bloc to, get itself into. They became a member of Shanghai Organization. They are a member of BRICS right now. Do you think they can find permanently to do business with China and be immune to U.S. sanctions?
No, they're not going to be immune to U.S. sanctions for a variety of reasons. But at the end of the day, a good example is that ultimately the oil trade is conducted in U.S. dollars. There's very little oil trade that's conducted in any other currency. The U.S. dollar remains the world's reserve currency, and it's used in the vast majority of all financial transactions, either on the selling or the buying side or both. And so that means that the U.S. financial system is indispensable to the kinds of economic endeavors that the regime in Tehran wants to conduct, whether they have a close relationship with the Chinese Communist Party or not. Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party are playing a very elaborate game, and they are exploiting the weakness of the Biden administration in the Middle East. And you see how they did that by brokering the so-called rapprochement between Tehran and Riyadh. But the Chinese are doing this for their own ulterior motives. They're not interested in the well-being of the Iranian people. They're interested in assured access to energy, particularly in the event that they decide to attack Taiwan, which I think we're all very, very concerned about the possibility of that. So that's the kind of game that the Chinese communists are playing in the Middle East.
Yeah, other thing is that I talked recently with one of the China specialists. She told me Chinese government gives this autocrat in the world loans with not much of an attachment, so you can. It's not attached with anything. They can do whatever they want with it or so. If that case happens, most of the countries in the Persian Gulf are U.S. allies, and they're relying on U.S. for security. But they are very authoritarian autocrats as well. Do you think they're in some way could be attracted to have better Chinese relation than U.S. relation?
So the thing about the way the Chinese use debt traps, which is what it is, right, is it looks like easy money up front, but there are strings. The strings are all attached on the back end. The Chinese don't do anything out of the goodness of their heart. They're not a I don't know what the right word is, but they're not a benevolent lender. They have all kinds of motives, and you see it, for instance, with respect to the Sri Lankans found out the hard way with regard to the loan that was made to build a port in Sri Lanka, and then the Chinese came in and seized it. So we see that time and again around the world. And I believe that our partners in the Middle East are very aware of this trap, but almost all of our partners in the region are also financially pretty well off, and they don't actually need to take sort of easy Chinese money with those strings. The Iranians, that may be a different case, and they may learn the hard way.
I wanted to ask if the monies like bitcoins have any future in for the repressive governments like Islamic Republic, Iran, to be able to do business without, as you said, not being connected to the US dollar, which is dominant all around the world. Cryptocurrency, I'm sorry.
Crypto assets. Certainly, the use of crypto assets to evade sanctions is happening, and it's a real concern, which is why one of the good things that the Treasury Department has done under the Biden-Harris administration has been to target many of these exchanges that are actually laundering money for regimes like Iran. That said, at the end of the day, people need physical hard currency banknotes. You are not at the point now where you can go buy a loaf of bread with a Bitcoin, maybe in Japan or a few other countries, but certainly not in Tehran. So people still want dollars and euros and pounds, and trade, like I mentioned, is still being conducted in fiat currencies. These cryptocurrencies, at the end of the day, other than the stable coins that are pegged very directly with cash reserves to back it up, the rest of these virtual assets, as we call them in the Financial Action Task Force, they're Ponzi schemes. They're speculative. Bitcoin only has value because you and I agree it has value. Okay, the moment one of us loses faith in that value, it becomes much, much less valuable. And so that's why we see these cyclical swings. So I believe that blockchain and distributed ledgers are here to stay, and that they will bring great benefit, but the international financial community has to impose and enforce the same anti-money laundering rules on crypto exchanges that we do on money service businesses, on banks, etc. And that actually is a standard that the Financial Action Task Force adopted on my watch, and they're proceeding with implementing.
One thing that's worrisome financially, as you said, for example, Islamic Republic it's expensive to run a nuclear program, and if you take the money out, they cannot do it. But there's something happening in this world right now, which is huge war in Russia and Ukraine. China has its own proxies, from North Korea to Islamic Republic to others. So, are there ways to do financial and be able to stop this whole war activities that's going on in the world, especially in Europe right now?
From time to time, the Congress implements a law that creates a special commission to look at our nation's strategic posture. It's called the Strategic Posture Commission. 12 commissioners, I was one. We issued our report this past October, and it was unanimous, and it was bipartisan. 6 Republicans, 6 Democrats, 6 men, 6 women, one set of findings and one set of recommendations. I would call your attention to 2 things. First is that we warn in the Posture Commission report that the global order established by the United States and our allies after the Second World War is under great threat. And it's under threat by these authoritarian regimes like Russia and China, supported by these lesser dictatorships like North Korea and Iran, who want to overturn that order. Now, they want a rules-based order too, but it's their rules. And I guarantee you nobody wants to live under Chinese Communist Party rules, at least in the free world. The second thing I would call your attention to in that report is that we called for the integration of financial and economic tools into our deterrence strategy. It's something that people talk a good game about. Here in Washington, it's very fashionable for people to say whole of government this and whole of government that. But when you actually look at the careful planning to conduct phased economic and financial pressure against an adversary to deter them before they engage in a hostile action, it isn't happening. It didn't happen with Vladimir Putin. There were a bunch of vague, ominous threats issued by the Biden-Harris administration warning Putin about consequences, and he looked back at 2014 and the minimal effect that the Obama-Biden sanctions had on him and said, I can shrug this off. And so he proceeded. And now you look at the sanctions that were imposed, he's weathering those sanctions not because sanctions don't work. They do work. We proved it with regard to Iran, Venezuela, etc. But they don't work when they're riddled with loopholes. When you won't sanction the main revenue stream, oil, in the case of both Iran and Russia. When you don't sanction all of their banks, which the Biden-Harris administration has not done to the Russians. And Xi Jinping is doing the math for himself as he eyes Taiwan. So we need very much to begin to integrate detailed, iterative planning to conduct these financial and economic operations in the run-up to hostilities, during hostilities, and then with a plan for recovery post-aggression.
Don't you think that findings, which is unanimous, bipartisan, should be part of a national strategy of the United States, no matter which government is coming?
Yes, 100%. And I believe the strength of the Commission's assessment resides in the fact that you had 6 very, very senior Democrats and 6 senior Republicans, all of whom came together based on a common understanding of the threat and reached a common set of recommendations. So my hope is, every administration when they come to office, and the Harris-Waltz team would do this too, conducts their own review of our national security strategy, our national defense strategy, and so on. They conduct a nuclear posture review, they conduct a missile defense review, and so on. And I believe that these bipartisan recommendations made just this past October should be the foundation for much of that work. We've already done it for them, so they don't have to reinvent the wheel in many respects.
It's fabulous to talk to you, and I'm sure we can talk hours, but let me ask you my last question, if I may. If the Ukraine war goes on like that it is going, it made some enable movers, players in the region, like Islamic Republic, like that axis of resistance, or what they're doing in the region. What are the dangers of that war just keep going on without not much of a ending in sight? Because clearly Russia is not taking over Ukraine. Ukraine is not sending Russia back. There's a war, and it's a war machine, and it's costly, and it just takes lives and causes wreak havoc in the region. What we would, if this goes like this, what's the scenarios that we could foresee?
Well, we can't have a never-ending war raging in the heart of Europe. And the butchery, the Russian atrocities against the Ukrainian people, the savagery that we've seen, the massacres in Bucha, the missile strikes on kindergartens, on museums, efforts to eradicate the kidnapping of Ukrainian children. We've seen this before from the Russians, by the way. We saw this behavior when they occupied the Baltic nations after the Second World War. These mass atrocities are right out of the same playbook. So this war does have to come to an end. The Ukrainians, by the way, are not just stopping the Russian attacks. They've actually recently taken a big chunk of Russian territory around Kursk. So the conditions are being laid by the Ukrainians for a negotiated outcome, I believe. But the best way to support them in achieving that outcome is to cripple the Russian economy by imposing just two things. It's all it takes. Sanction all the Russian banks and go after the Russian oil exports. If you go after the Russian oil exports and you go after the banks, the Russian war machine grinds to a halt. They have a lot less money to pay off the Iranians for cruise missiles, potentially ballistic missiles now we're hearing in the press. They have fewer and fewer things they can offer to the North Koreans. This is the way to get to some sort of freeze in the case of Ukraine. But my heart goes out to the Ukrainian people every single day.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated you coming here and talking to us.
Thank you for having me.